This week for my National Park Service tour, I'm heading to a site that was the absolute wildest frontier at the beginning of the 19th century, and by the end had been surrounded and found itself in the middle and even a little bit passed by. I'm talking about Fort Smith, Arkansas. I chose this place partly because it is so typical of how the world was changing so fast during the period of time we are in, and how it was instrumental in many of the changes that were going on at the time. Right on the border of what is now Arkansas and Oklahoma, the spot was chosen because it was a center of commerce and a crossroads, and for the purposes of supply was at the confluence of two cooperative rivers, the Poteau and the Arkansas. With the Louisiana Purchase, the country was out to stake some claims on what they thought they had bought, and Fort Smith was part of that. However, the importance of the fort and the town that grew up around it would become even more so as it became the center for law and order, as it was administered upon the new Indian Territory that would be set up as a result of the Indian removals conducted by Andrew Jackson in the 1840s and beyond. As part of his presidential campaign, Andrew Jackson had promised to give ever more land to the European colonists and settlers. And to accomplish that, he displaced 5 Indian nations in a process that began in the 1830s and came to a messy, deadly conclusion with the Trail of Tears and similar forcible removals that resulted in the Creek, Cherokee, Choctaw, Chickasaw, and finally the Seminole nations being taken out of their hill, forest, coastal, and riverside homelands and being plopped down in the rolling grasslands of Oklahoma. The way the world looked to those who settled in and around Fort Smith was very different from what was going on in the rapidly growing and mechanizing population centers out on the coast. And the news, for the most part, did not travel fast. So if you're looking for a very different view of young America and how this one saw the world, it's worth a visit to the wide open spaces of Arkansas and a peek inside this different perspective on America's early years. Episode 121, Salt and Other Chemicals. Hello, and welcome to the History of American Food. This week, I'll be looking at the birth of the salt and chemical industry that will ultimately alter the American food into its modern, shelf-stable self. And it all really begins here in the early 19th century. Sure, the salt trade is as old as cooking. The salt-making industry in America and all the other chemicals that start to be made here, well, that was a new thing. To learn about this fundamental, character-forming, but often invisible part of American food, pull up to your place at the table and let's dig in. The first thing you need to know is that until the Revolutionary War, most salt used in America had been imported from England. But once we broke away and got blockaded, the manufacture of American salt as big business began and has only grown over the years. Almost right from the start, it was recognized that salt, while handy for cooking and food preservation, would be an essential industry as America set itself up to participate in global trade and materials manufacture. Now, if you've been listening to the back catalog, you know that I have a bunch of episodes on salt, and this is far from my last. However, this is an important episode as it covers the time when salt transforms from a somewhat dear and precious commodity to something that is always around and always on hand. Some important chemical things are finally being understood about salt at this point in time in history, and there are major technological jumps about to occur in the manufacture of salt. Salt was everywhere before. Humans needed it to get around and live in places where food wasn't obtainable year-round. But up until now, salt making was somewhat labor-intensive, and the quantity was small enough that it could be heavily taxed and was mostly used in food. And while I very much agree that there would be no America without the growth of the sugar trade in the 18th century, I often think there would have been no age of exploration at all, with people traveling on boats for months at a time without the technology of preserving food with salt. But the chemical awakening of the 18th century, where people started getting systems around science, sharing information instead of treating it as more or less mysterious and magical knowledge, that's what allowed technology and industries to grow up around the manufacture and refining of chemicals. And since salt was the first one everyone could agree on as, hey, we need that, widespread salt manufacture was first. But the science that goes into mechanizing salt manufacture and refining opens the doors to understanding other chemicals. And so researching early 19th century salt also meant getting into the early food chemical industry as well. Anyway, hold on to your coffee cake recipes because chemical yeast is part of the salt revolution. So, a little trip into the weeds. The salt we mean when we're talking about salt in food context is sodium chloride. And if you want more on salts chemically, jump back to an early bonus episode, 10.5, Extra Salt. But for now, a little name in chemistry history. Chlorine was given its name because the pure gas is green. It actually comes from the same Greek root that gives us the word chlorophyll. And sodium was given its name because the element was isolated from something called soda ash, sodium, or what we in the systematically named chemical world know as sodium carbonate. That's two NAs with a CO3. This, by the way, is a stronger base than sodium bicarbonate, also known as sodium hydrogen carbonate, or NaHCO3, and what we generally known as baking soda. Way back in the day, before people were naming chemicals and elements and doing chemistry class and stuff, it was known that plants grown in salty places, next to desert salt lakes or on the seashore, when they were burned, they produced ashes that when leached or soaked and then the resulting water was concentrated into a powder, it produced something that was known as soda ash. And this stuff was super important in making glass, all the way back to the Egyptians and their glass beads and fans. And when the same treatment was applied to the ashes of hardwood fires, generally cooking fires, a similar but different chemical was produced, potash, which lent its name to potassium. So you have sodium and potassium, but there's not even a periodic table yet. That doesn't even happen until 1871. I mean, we just passed the 150th anniversary of the dang thing. Which means that the word soda, like soda ash, caustic soda, soda water, baking soda, washing soda, etc., have been in use much longer than words like sodium carbonate and sodium hydroxide and carbonated water and sodium hydrogen carbonate and hydrated sodium carbonate. That is, the standardized chemical identifiers of all of these household chemicals. I mean, for a while there, people thought that refined soda ash, the sodium carbonate, was an element. There didn't seem to be a way to break it down further. Until electrolysis started to be applied to chemicals. That's right. Once people figured out how to make and control electricity, it was suddenly this new toy of the late 18th and 19th century. And so the nutty scientists in the shed crowd started to be able to separate things that were thought of as previously inseparable. It was as much of a magic key for understanding new things in science as DNA sequencing was in the late 20th and 21st centuries. I mean, it led to people understanding that water wasn't an element, that it was actually a molecule made up of two elements, hydrogen and oxygen. It was what really changed the idea of elements from earth, air, fire, and water to what we finally got as the periodic table of elements. In some ways, it's almost impossible to wrap our modern heads around how much the world was about to change, how different it was in the first half of the 19th century. The idea that there was this collection of fewer than 100 things that when you combine them in different ways make up everything in the whole universe, and that was made into the periodic table, because I'm not including the synthetic elements, it forever altered the way people who made stuff were going to see the world and interact with it. As a result, it would also change the rest of us as consumers and what we expected of the world. which meant in those decades leading up to writing down and registering those discoveries, it was a chaotic time, and people were poking very hard at the fabric of the world and the ideas about how the whole thing worked. So back up to where we are. As far as the question of where do we get our salt, the answer up until the big wars in America, the answer had been from the ocean. Either we would boil water from the sea, mostly, or we were importing it from across the sea, from England and countries around the Mediterranean. But as we know, there were a couple of wars with folks across the Atlantic, and they got real shirty about shipping over and selling salt, which meant pre-America and baby America had to set up some salt works. But as you might have guessed, running salt works is an awful lot of work. You have to haul water from the ocean, you have to chop wood, boil water, scrape salt. Ugh, it's hot, it's corrosive, and boy, does it ruin your clothes. I mean, there were some spots that set up solar evaporation ponds, but that meant you needed somewhere that it was really sunny, or you built a bunch of roofs to protect your salt from the rain, which is exactly what happened in salt-making ventures in places like Cape Cod and other sunny spots along the East Coast. And when it really came down to it, turning seawater into salt just takes time. If only there were some place that a bunch of salt was already gathered in one place. Now, by the 19th century, your average big idea man knew that such places did exist in places in the world. For example, Salzburg, Austria, was famous for its ancient salt mines. I mean, Salzburg literally translates to salt city. And salt springs were part of the round of pilgrimage spots and spas people visited in hope of healing cures, and salt flats and deserts were known things. But to the people with big ideas in America, they just knew of the places that were in Europe or North Africa. Surely, in this land of plenty of everything, land and deer and cod, surely there must also be plenty of salt. And it turns out there was. While the generally accepted lore about the colonizer takeover of land from the Native Americans leans on the conversion of land for hunting into land for farming and things like keeping cows, the hunt for salt is almost always left out. Yet, colonists and pioneers and settlers, as they got away from the Atlantic coast, they left behind their known sources of salt. And they were finding, somehow, along with the hides and the pemmican and the parched corn, the local tribes that they were trading with or raiding would often have cakes of salt to trade or steal. Now, some were mined chunks, but others were clearly dried salt. Among the important home sites, orchards, foraging lands, fishing spots, and hunting grounds that the local tribes fought to protect from invading land-hungry Europeans, salt springs and salt seeps were also sites they sought to protect from conquest. There are lots of places to shoot a deer from, and you can move grapevines and peach trees to another spot. But the source of a salt seep, that's impossible to move. And more than one set of treaty negotiations tripped not on access to land for hunting, but rather on the desire for an up-and-coming industrialist to cut off public access to a source of salt. A pretty early example is Lake Onondaga, along the city of Syracuse, New York. It has several salt springs along its edge. Early settlement there and early salt production from those springs, along with its location between Lake Erie and the Hudson River, led to it being included in part of the extra routes on the Erie Canal. When the canal opened in 1825, it wasn't just about transporting all that upstate flatland wheat into the city. Barges of salt from towns like Liverpool and Salina that had sprung up to produce commercial salt prospered as well and fed the ever-growing food industries that ran on salt. At the same time, the cod fishery was expanding to feed the growing sugar operations in the Caribbean, ever-expanding wars, thanks Napoleon, in Europe, and ever further wandering whalers. They all wanted more salt to preserve barreled fish and beef and pork. Expanding textile operations also meant more salt was needed for dyeing operations. The buckskins that were feeding the growing fancy pants obsessions of the British also needed salt to cure the hides correctly. And as dairy operations expanded in America, more salt was needed to make more cheese. I mean, no one could drink all the milk fresh that was being made, and besides, who would want only milk when you could make cheese? And the early 19th century is the source of the salt boiled potato, by the way. Plopping your dinner potatoes in boiling brine as you were working to make salt created a dish still touted as a central New York original. And the recipe for these potatoes is so short, I'll just tell it to you. You dissolve a cup of salt, and yes, I mean 150 grams of salt in a gallon or 4 liters of water. And this imitates the brine that the salt boilers were working with. It takes a bit of stirring to get all that salt to dissolve, but you'll get there. To that, add about 3 pounds or 1.3 kilograms of little potatoes. Important point, keep the skins intact. Otherwise, they will be so salty, they will be inedible. Now you bring the whole thing to a boil and simmer until the potatoes are fork tender. Sort of, you can poke them easily with a fork. It's like 25-30 minutes. From there, you drain them in a colander where they develop a bit of a salty crust. And from there, you eat them with unsalted butter or some other creamy, unsalty thing. And if you're feeling fancy, you add some herbs, parsley, chives, or whatever you have on hand to celebrate that you're eating this by choice and not because you're an Irish immigrant escaping poverty because the English have stolen all the food from Ireland. But it wasn't just New York salt springs that were driving development. Pennsylvania, Ohio, and Arkansas, and contested territory in what is now Texas, all had salt sources that drove settlement. Salt springs and salt seeps pepper the New York-Pennsylvania border. Ohio had brine wells that fed its salt needs for provisioning the lake traffic and supplying the farms that were spreading out along the fertile shores of Lake Erie, since the recently encroaching British had been forced out by the end of the War of 1812. The treaties and scuffles and fights over salt sources contained within the Louisiana Purchase were domestic conflicts, and mainly between expansionist-minded Americans and local tribes. As a result, they are poorly documented, and often the salt aspect is rarely considered. But in the Texas and New Mexico El Paso area, global politics come into play, and as a result, you can look up the El Paso Salt Wars quite easily. Now, the whole thing gets going because under Spanish royal law, all mines of minerals and such are de facto property of the state and the monarch. And in the case of the salt mines and the salinas in the El Paso area, access to the salt flats and springs and such had been granted to the people by the kings of Spain since the 1600s. I know, very generous. This view was much more in keeping with the habit of communal land use that was customary for the native peoples of North America and Central America, whether the land had been claimed by the Spanish, the French, or the British, or the Americans. As a result, people like the silver miners, the O'odham, the Apaches, and other local tribes, farmers from northern central Mexico, missionaries, and just regular people passing through would travel to the salt flats around El Paso to gather up a year's worth of salt or even lots of salt to sell. And this went on long enough and at high enough intensity that modern high-definition satellite imagery of the area can pick up traces of the trails worn into the earth to these salt flats. And they even match up with old hand-drawn maps over hundreds of years. But then Texas became officially incorporated into the United States, and America's legal system and attitudes towards natural resources had an English origin story. As a result, mineral rights and the ability to grant access to them belong to the person who owns the land, not the crown or some sort of central government. And then things got even messier because American law, right from the get-go, started granting something called severed rights. That is, you might have surface rights or mineral rights to a certain piece of property. And this would lead to all manner of mining shenanigans, which were just about to kick off with the Virginia coal boom and the rise of steamships and steam-powered factories. And trains. Don't forget the trains. That's right. What was going on was just because you own the top skin of your property, you may not own it all the way down. And so somebody who had purchased the mineral rights could just dig the literal earth out from under you. Very Mr. Burns diagonal drilling operation stuff. But back here with salt, when El Paso became American, no one thought to tell all the people who had been using the salt flats in the area that they were suddenly on private property. And honestly, the question hadn't really mattered all that much until some Texas local bigwigs using questionable means had tried to claim the salt flats and then lease the rights to them to one Mr. McGoffin. Mr. McGoffin essentially wanted to charge a toll to all of the salt collectors. Now, all these purely greed-based moves resulted in salt collectors shot dead, panicked horses, lost carts, and the U.S. government, which was too tied up in things that mattered more to them than this godforsaken salty piece of desert, told McGoffin to cut it out and please not start a war with the Spanish Empire. Thank you very much. And that's where things stood on the salt question in the salt flats around El Paso until after the Civil War. So now we head back to Fort Smith, Arkansas. Along with being all of the things that it was, Fort Smith was also partly placed where it was placed because it was near Salt Springs and had been a lively trading center for the local pre-removal tribes along the Arkansas River. And Fort Smith would change from a small frontier outpost to that law enforcement and army center as it took up the responsibility of policing the severely disrupted people in what was generally known as Indian Territory. Because of its proximity to these salt springs, one of the first big disputes that Fort Smith had to settle between the encroaching settlers and the recently displaced tribes was enforcing the tribal ownership of salt springs and salines so they could profit from the sale of the salt from these resources. I mean, these nations had just been forced out of their old homelands, and suddenly it seems a little much that somehow they couldn't control the salt resources that were part of these new lands they had just been given. Bitterly, while these nations would generally persevere in salt claims, things would not go so well in matters of oil, gold, and other less ubiquitous and more monetarily rewarding mineral. I mean, America was on a growth spurt, and it wasn't thinking too hard about the feelings of others. At the end of the 18th century, America was just the 13 original states plus 3 more, Vermont, Kentucky, and Tennessee. But in the first half of the 19th century, following the Louisiana Purchase, all sorts of states appeared. 17 more before the start of the Civil War, and then 3 more during it. Now, some were pretty close, like Ohio, Louisiana, Indiana, Mississippi, Alabama, and Maine. But others were a stretch. Illinois, Missouri, Arkansas, Michigan, Iowa, and Wisconsin. Some were score settling with the weakening Spanish Empire, like Florida, Texas, and California. And California was a confirmation of the whole manifest destiny thing, along with Oregon, both brought in by the gold rush, the whaling, and the race to sell furs to the cold people of the world. What's wild is Kansas and West Virginia were made states during the Civil War. Now, they were mostly about score settling, but so was Nevada, though that one was really just about silver and getting enough cash to keep building the railroads. Anyway, what all this means, this explosive expansion of the country meant lots more traveling, by foot, by cart and wagon, by boat, and by the ever-growing trains on the ever-growing railroad, which meant the need for salt was definitely not slowing down. And the salt needs weren't just about directly seasoning and preserving food with salt. Salt and the associated sodas were increasingly being consumed by the growth of a number of American industries. Soda ash, or sodium carbonate, was needed to make glass, and in the processing of metals to make bottles and cans to keep and carry food in. Not to mention to build a bunch of the industrial equipment that was coming online. And the cotton industry was flourishing, which meant that there was more cloth, which meant that there was a dyeing industry that was expanding as well, which also needs a lot of salt and washing soda and caustic soda, or hydrated sodium carbonate and sodium hydroxide. That same caustic soda was also used in the conversion of old rags into paper, and a process for making soda ash out of common salt was also developed, which caused soap to become more common. And in America, where animal slaughter was starting to become centralized, soap factories using this chemically produced soda ash would make soap from the fatty scraps from the slaughterhouses. And as kerosene and coal gas and soon electricity started to cut into the whale market, whale oil soap would also hit those brand new shelves in all of those brand new stores. In this first half of the 19th century, salt was being made in every way it could by boiling salt water and the richer brine seeping up from inland springs. It was being mined out of caves where it was found and dried by the sun. And the salt mining operations would also run up against other soda deposits, the washing, the caustic, and the soda ash. I mean, Egyptian natron, a mixture of soda ash and other sodas, was a major global commodity as it fed the growing glass, cloth dyeing, and paper industries as they grew around the world. And as chemicals were more precisely isolated, classified, and described, the processes for making and using them could also be duplicated and spread. So it was really the early 19th century when alchemy was put away. It became stories and legends and cautionary tales. Chemistry created a common scientific language. I mean, people were still burning off their fingerprints and putting out their eyes using explosions in sheds in the yard. But thermometers and hygrometers and a common language of weights and measures and minutes were bringing it all together. It had started with salt, this one chemical we all can't do without, given our Earth origins as water babies. But in the 19th century, we found common words to talk about so many more chemicals and pin down how we were all talking about the same thing. Which gets us, believe it or not, at last, to coffee cakes and our fluffy biscuits. Now, I spoke about the fracturing of the meaning of biscuit back in Season 2, Episode 66, and talked lightly on the introduction of chemicals like saleratus, pearl ash, and, other chemical yeast stuff. In the early 19th century, with people trekking across the Louisiana Purchase on the Oregon Trail and the California Trail, they would find a new baking companion, sodium carbonate crystals on the edges of Badwater or alkali springs. Sure, a thirsty cowboy and his lonely pinto pony would see these water holes with white crystals around the edge as bad news. But to a woman in search of something to lighten up the cornbread, grinding up the crystals and then combining them with sour milk or vinegar would make something lighter and much more pleasant to eat. Now, chemically, all of these precursors to baking soda were mixtures that contained either sodium carbonate, or soda ash, or potassium carbonate, potash, both generally crystallized goodies from the leaching of hardwood ash or something from the natron fields, or just maybe a bit of magic snitched from a glassworks. But now with westward expansion, that sodium carbonate could be snitched from the edges of Badwater pools. And in messing about with soda ash and adding carbon dioxide and working out the process to make plain old sodium chloride salt into soda ash using some other chemicals, that is where we got sodium bicarbonate. Bicarb, sodium hydrogen carbonate, baking soda. And with the invention and spread of baking soda, it became hands down the most popular. See, when it comes down to it, sodium carbonate is a pretty strong base, and too much of it can really kind of mess up your hands. I mean, it's used for bleaching. But the big thing is, to get it to work, to cause that lift, to get it to release its carbon dioxide and cause the bubbles that makes baked goods lighter, you have to have some acid on hand. But with bicarb, baking soda, using acid, yes, does cause all of the carbon dioxide to release. But if you don't have any acid on hand, just baking the bicarb crystals at 80 C or 170 Fahrenheit causes them to give off half their CO2. You suddenly had a magical powder that even without acid could cause your bread to rise. And I mean, it used to be that if you wanted a lightly risen baked good, you had to start on that 12 to 24 hours ahead. And that was after you made your own yeast. I mean, this instant rise stuff, it was a miracle. Now, think about how it worked for women on the move, or for women in kitchens that didn't have cooperative circumstances needed to make in baby yeast cultures. Times during the year when it was too cold or too dry, or you just didn't have time. Which meant, as salt and chemical manufacture grew, access to these marvelous chemical yeasts also spread. And they found themselves in the American biscuit, but they also found themselves in the sweet quick breads or coffee cakes that came out of the big wheat basket of the Hudson Valley. Now, for those not in the know, coffee cakes are fluffy, sweet, spiced cakes, sometimes with fruit or nuts in them, risen with chemical leavening, as opposed to the yeast-raised cakes before. And they don't taste like coffee. They were very specifically developed to be served alongside coffee. And the fact that these coffee cakes were originally quite popular in the Hudson Valley leads to some fun food conjecture. Now, just as I speculated back in my episodes on the Dutch of New York that diner culture owes something to Dutch food habits and styles of eating, it seems that coffee cakes may as well. As far back as the 14th century, the Dutch had a special gingerbread that was unlike any other European gingerbread. It was a fluffy gingerbread. And at the time, the secret to this seasonal treat depended on the addition of a very closely guarded secret ingredient that was added by the Burgermeister, basically the mayor, just before the gingerbread was headed to the oven. And the secret seemingly was more or less successfully guarded until the 1750s, when a Dutch cookbook may have spilled the beans. It made reference to a chemical yeast. And this makes sense because you start to see the term chemical yeast in cookbooks that appear at the end of the 18th century. And one of the products that it was generally added to, along with the biscuits of the South, were these quick cakes that could be served with afternoon or evening coffee on short notice, and showed up all over the Dutch settled Hudson Valley of New York. I mean, just think about it. The glass jars of a few episodes ago could keep exotic spices away from air and moisture. The Erie Canal was now bringing in less expensive flour from the wide flat fields of central New York and the new Ohio farmlands. And they were processed in one of these new automatic mills. Pecans were imported from cantankerous Texas territory that's just about to be a state, or finally was, by the middle of the century. And these start to show up in your new town store. And you have one of these new quick heating iron ovens indoors. You have cheaper sugar from the well-established trade routes to the Caribbean, and even sugar factories springing up in Louisiana. And on top of all of that, you have this new chemical leavener. And suddenly, it doesn't take 3 days to make a yeasty tea cake. You can decide to make a coffee cake in the morning and have it ready in time for afternoon or evening coffee. Think about how different the world would be. And so, just like that, everything was getting a little easier. Okay, except laundry. That's pretty much the same. Though to be fair, with more salt in the manufacture of cheaper washing soda, the soap is getting better, so there's that. And it's not just cheaper salt and more available chemicals that's changing American food. Something else big is about to happen, and that is the capturing of the cold. So join me in my next episode where we start to look at how American food is going to change yet again with the arrival of refrigeration. Thanks for listening. Any email, questions, or quibbles will continue to reach me at thehistoryofamericanfood@gmail.com. Downloading and commenting on the episodes helps me know that you're out there. And even better than that you're listening to and hopefully enjoying the show, or at least you find it interesting. Now, if you want more food and history in your future, you can catch me doing a deep dive on the 19th century with a co-host of mine, Jamie Lewis of Plague of String. I'll finish up posting the rest of our Shogun series on off weeks, but if you would like to get into our much looser and rather wilder podcasts, Prize Fighters, Circus Freaks, and Gangsters, there's still food, but now it comes with fashion, fighting, fraud, and a few other Fs, which means that this one's for fun as opposed to this podcast, which strives to be E for everyone. Music for this podcast is Finger Olympics by Dr. Turtle. And as always, you can find me around the social medias as @THOA Food, and all this information is available in the show description.